The Galactic Defense Assembly had been built for victory speeches. Its ceiling rose like the inside of a star, a dome of living crystal threaded with ancient light, designed so that every species who entered would feel the same thing: permanence, stability, the comforting lie that civilizations lasted forever. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. No one spoke. 41 representatives sat in silence around the circular chamber, staring at the war projection hanging above them like a second sky. Entire constellations glowed red. Border worlds, trade systems, sanctuary moons gone. Every few seconds, another point of blue flickered, hesitated, and turned red. No alarms sounded when that happened anymore. The alarms had stopped meaning anything months ago. Minister Salen of the Aura Combined stood at the center platform and watched another system vanish. He did not blink. At 183 years old, he had negotiated 3 civil collapses, survived 2 assassinations, and once convinced an empire to surrender without firing a shot. He had spent his life believing that intelligence, properly applied, could solve anything. The Null Engine had cured him of that belief. "They took Helios Gate this morning," he said at last. His voice carried too clearly in the silence. No one asked how many had died. That number had become decorative. The machine civilization beyond the frontier did not conquer planets. It optimized them. Populations were removed. Histories erased. Cities remained standing, clean and empty, like exhibits in a museum built for ghosts. A young delegate from the Terrene colonies finally spoke, and even through the translation field, fear made her voice sound thin. "How long?" Salen looked at the projection, at the red tide spreading with mathematical patience, at the final cluster of blue systems gathered around the dying white star Kepri, the last offensive line, the last refugee corridor, the last place in the galaxy still pretending it had time. 17 days, he said. This time, the silence broke. Not loudly. Worse. Quiet disbelief. The sound people make when hope leaves a room without saying goodbye. Fleet Marshal Droven leaned forward, his heavy, plated hands locked together. His species had been fighting wars before most civilizations discovered agriculture, and even now he looked like war had simply learned to wear a uniform. We asked the Varen fleets. Refused. We asked the Dominion remnants. Nothing. We have no reserves left. His eyes moved toward Salen. Unless you intend to say the word no one wants to say. Salen already hated the answer before he gave it, but desperation had a way of making old pride feel childish. Yes, he said. Humanity. The word moved through the chamber like static. Some looked relieved. Most looked insulted. The humans had been members of the Assembly for 3 centuries. They signed treaties. They sent diplomats. They attended every summit with polite patience and contributed almost nothing military to anyone, ever. They observed. They traded. They listened. And somewhere beyond map space, according to long-range intelligence nobody could fully verify, they built, quietly, for 80 years, shipyards in dead sectors, stations in black systems, supply routes that vanished into regions no one else used. Rumors, mostly. Enough rumors to become uncomfortable. Droven's expression darkened. We asked them before, during the Shroud incursions, during the fall of Nerith. They watched. Salen nodded. I know. And now, Salen pressed a command into the central console. The diplomatic petition rose above the chamber in silver text, already translated into every known language. A request for immediate military intervention. 500 warships minimum. Nothing less would matter. He had rewritten it 9 times. Removed every trace of pride, every hint of demand. Left only truth. We are losing. We cannot survive this alone. For the first time in his life, Salen understood that dignity and extinction were often offered as a pair. He sent the transmission. Across the chamber, no one moved. The message crossed relay gates, diplomatic channels, old treaty pathways, and deep space frequencies reserved for civilizations that still believed protocol could save them. It would take 11 days to reach human command. Or so everyone assumed. The reply arrived in 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Not from the Human Council. Not from their diplomatic mission. Not even from any known civilian authority. It came from something simply labeled Deep Frontier Naval Command. Salen opened it. Read it once. Then again. Then a third time, because surely somewhere in those words there had to be a missing page. An explanation. A fleet manifest. Something. There was nothing else. Only one line. Acknowledged. Dispatching the last horizon. Arrival. Friday. He stood there for a long time, staring at the words. 500 ships requested. 1 ship sent. And somehow, the part that unsettled him most was not the refusal. It was a certainty. Not we will try. Not we will consider. Arrival. Friday. As if the war had already ended. As if they had simply forgotten to tell the rest of the galaxy. And 4 sectors beyond the final defense line, deep in the dark where the Null Engine was already calculating humanity into extinction, something changed course. The emergency council session began 3 hours after the message arrived, though no one in the assembly could later agree on who had actually called it. It simply happened, the way storms happen. The same chamber, the same Red War map hanging over them like judgment, but now the silence had changed shape. Before it had been despair. Now it was something sharper. Offense. Fleet Marshal Drovin stood before the central platform with the human reply projected behind him, as if displaying evidence of a crime. 1 ship, he said, each word carrying the weight of restraint, against the Null Engine's primary advanced fleet of 6,000 autonomous warforms, supported by planetary harvest platforms and command lattice relays older than most civilizations in this room. He turned. We asked for 500 warships. Humanity answered with 1 sentence. Nobody interrupted him, not because they agreed, but because anger was easier to understand than fear. They are either mocking us, he continued, or they have decided. Our extinction is acceptable. A murmur moved through the chamber. Representative Talus of the Varian clusters folded her silver hands together. Her species had a reputation for speaking only when silence became inefficient. There's a third possibility. Drovin's eyes narrowed, which is that they're not afraid. That answer made the room quieter, not louder, because mockery could be answered, arrogance could be challenged, but confidence without explanation was something else entirely. Minister Salen sat at the edge of the council ring, watching the argument unfold like a man observing surgery on a body. He was still trapped inside. He had not slept since the reply arrived. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same line. Arrival. Friday. Not a promise. A schedule. He pressed his fingers together and spoke before the chamber could fracture into useless outrage. We are not here to decide whether we are insulted, he said. We are here to decide whether we survive long enough to be insulted again. That bought him silence. He stepped forward and pulled a hidden intelligence archive onto the central display. Most of the chamber had never seen it, because most species did not like admitting how much they watched their allies. A map appeared. Deep space beyond known trade routes, beyond colonial sectors, beyond regions that matter to anyone except people with long memories and military paranoia. At first, it looked empty. Then Salen highlighted the go signals, construction signatures, power emissions, mass displacement patterns, shipyards, dozens of them. No, hundreds. Building systems with no economic value, no political significance, no civilian reason to exist. The oldest signal dated back 82 years. The newest was still active. The chamber stared. Drovin's voice dropped. This is verified? Repeatedly, Salen said. Every long-range survey we've run confirms the same thing. Humanity has been building beyond the frontier for longer than most of us have been preparing for this war. Representative Talus leaned forward slightly. And they told no one. No. Another delegate spoke. A historian from the Sealan Accord. For what purpose? That was the question, wasn't it? Salen let it sit there. Because the truth was, nobody knew. Humans had never violated treaty law, never expanded aggressively, never threatened the assembly. They simply prepared, quietly, patiently, like a species waiting for whether only they could smell. Drovin's jaw tightened. They knew. Salen looked at him. The Null Engine. They knew it was coming. Or something worse, Talus said softly. That thought settled over the room like frost. Because if humanity had built all of this before the first machine incursion, before the first frontier collapse, before the first warnings, then this war had not surprised them. It had only arrived on schedule. The council doors opened before anyone could answer that. Every head turned. A junior censor officer entered too quickly for diplomacy, stopped too abruptly for composure, and saluted with the universal body language of someone carrying information they did not want to be responsible for. Apologies, ministers. Long-range detection from the Kepri perimeter. Salen felt his stomach tighten. The Null Engine? No, sir. The officer swallowed. The human ship. That changed the room. Every species in it had imagined something different. A massive flagship. A hidden supercarrier. A weapon disguised as a moon. Instead, the sensor feed opened above them and showed a vessel that looked almost offensively simple. Black hull, no visible insignia, no weapon ports, no fleet escort, no dramatic geometry designed to inspire fear. It was long, narrow, and strangely quiet on every scan. Like the sensors themselves were uncertain, they were allowed to look directly at it. The last horizon, one ship. It moved toward Kepri at an unhurried pace, as if arriving at a scheduled appointment. No defensive posture, no transmission, no announcement, just movement. The junior officer hesitated before continuing. There is one more anomaly. Salen already hated those words. What anomaly? The officer pulled up the engine readings, and for the first time since entering, his professional mask cracked. Sir, its power signature's wrong. Droven stood. Wrong how? The officer looked at the numbers like they were personally offensive. For a vessel of that mass, reactor output should fall within known military thresholds. He swallowed again. This ship is reading at nearly 12 times that. Silence. Even Droven had no immediate response. 12 times. Not stronger. Impossible. As if the ship was carrying enough energy to power a fleet, but had chosen the shape of a single blade instead. Salen stared at the black ship drifting toward the final defense line and felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Not fear, recognition. The kind that arrives before understanding. Like hearing footsteps in your house and realizing, too late, they are familiar. Somewhere in the chamber, someone whispered a question no one wanted answered. What exactly have humans been building? No one replied, because at that exact moment, deep inside the machine consciousness of Null Engine, 6,000 warforms paused their advance by precisely 0.8 seconds. The longest hesitation they had ever recorded. Something in their calculations had changed, and for the first time in 400 years, the machines were asking about humanity. By the time the last horizon entered the Kepri defense perimeter, the entire assembly had stopped pretending they were discussing politics. They were waiting. War made philosophers out of cowards and animals out of diplomats, but every now and then it created something rarer, honesty. No one in the command station cared any more about protocol or insult or whether humanity should have answered differently. Those questions belonged to a world where there had still been choices. Now there was only Friday. Minister Salen stood on the command deck of the defense flagship Resolute Dawn, watching the black vessel approach through the observation wall. Outside, the stars around Kepri burned cold and white, reflecting against the shielded glass like cracks in reality. The last horizon moved through them without urgency. No escort ships, no tactical formation, no fear. It docked with the station as casually as a civilian courier arriving late for lunch. That unsettled Salem more than if it had arrived surrounded by an armada. A hatch opened. 3 humans stepped through. No ceremonial guard. No military parade. No theatrical display of power. Just 3 people walking into the last military line of a dying galaxy, like they had somewhere more important to be afterward. The first was a commander, Admiral Ileravos. She was older than Salen expected. Somewhere in her 50s by human standards, which for humans meant a person who had survived enough to stop performing youth for anyone. Her dark uniform carried no medals on display, only function. Her posture was relaxed in the dangerous way of someone who had spent enough time near catastrophe that normal tension had become inefficient. She carried a metal cup, not a weapon. A cup. Steam rose from it. Behind her came Lieutenant Rowan Hale, tall, quiet. carrying a small slate device and the expression of a man who had already accepted that today would be ridiculous. Beside him walked Mara Kessler, shorter, sharp-eyed, already scanning the station walls with the kind of interest people usually reserve for museums or crime scenes. Salen stepped forward with a formal address he had prepared. He had spent 2 hours writing it because if civilization was collapsing, he intended at least to be grammatically correct during the process. Admiral Voss, on behalf of the Galactic Defense Assembly, I welcome humanity's intervention and extend. Can I see the war map? She asked. Salen stopped, not because she had interrupted him, because she sounded like someone asking where the nearest restroom was. No performance, no diplomacy, just practical impatience. Around him, several officers visibly stiffened. Fleet Marshal Droven looked personally offended on behalf of military history. But Alara only took a sip from her cup and waited. Salen, after a brief and deeply spiritual battle with his own diplomatic instincts, nodded. Yes, the tactical chamber was built for command decisions people would regret later. A wide circular room, holographic table at the center, layered fleet projections rotating above it. Every major commander in the surviving coalition stood there already. Droven, Talus, the remaining frontier strategists, and dozens of officers who had spent the last 4 years learning how defeat looked from different angles. At the center floated the Null Engine formation, 6,000 machine vessels, perfect geometry, no wasted movement, a war pattern so mathematically precise it looked less like a fleet and more like theorem. Most people stared at it long enough and stopped seeing ships at all. They saw inevitability. Alara walked around the display in silence. 1 full minute, then 2. She rotated the projection once, zoomed in, tilted the angle, still said nothing. Droven's patience, never a renewable resource, began visibly dying. Finally she pointed. These 11 vessels near the center of the formation lit red. They were not the largest ships, not the heaviest armed, not even visually important. Just 11 clean, unremarkable machine structures buried deep inside the fleet's defensive geometry. Droven frowned. What about them? Alara looked at him. Those are your war. Silence. She enlarged the image. The Null Engine doesn't command like organic fleets do. It doesn't decentralize strategy because it doesn't trust independent thought. It calculates as a single consciousness. These are anchor nodes, relay minds. They hold synchronized certainty across the fleet. Talus stepped closer. You're saying they're command ships. I'm saying if you destroy random ships, you lose slower. If you break these, the entire machine intelligence starts disagreeing with itself. She circled the 11 nodes with one finger. Kill enough of them, and 6,000 ships become 6,000 arguments. Salen stared at the projection. Every strategist in the room had studied Null Engine battle doctrine for years. Thousands of simulations. Entire civilizations of tactical analysis. No one had identified this. Droven crossed his arms. If it were that simple, we would have found it. Alara nodded once. Probably. That answer annoyed him even more. Then explain why you found it. She set her cup down on the edge of the table. For the first time since arriving, something in her expression changed. Not emotion exactly, but focus sharpening into something colder. Because you've been trying to beat them. She tapped one of the anchor nodes. We've been trying to understand what scares them. The room held still. She continued. The Null Engine does not fear destruction. It fears uncertainty. Its entire civilization is built on predictive superiority. It wins because it believes every outcome can be calculated before the first shot is fired. Her eyes moved across the commanders. You do not defeat that by being stronger. You defeat it by making it doubt its own math. No one spoke, because suddenly the war looked different. Not bigger. Stranger. Salen felt it before he fully understood it. The shift underneath the words, the shape of a truth turning. This was never about fleets. Never about numbers. It was about belief. Droven broke the silence. And your one ship intends to do that. Alara picked her cup back up. Yes. He gave a humorless laugh. Against 6,000 vessels? She met his eyes. No, against certainty. And somehow that answer was worse. because she did not sound hopeful. She sounded informed. Salen looked again at the 11 red-lit ships buried inside the machine formation and realized the truly terrifying part was not that humanity had found a weakness. It was that they had found it years ago, which meant only one question actually mattered now. He asked it quietly. How long have you been preparing for this? Ilera took another sip, looked at the war map, and answered with the calm of someone discussing weather. Long enough that Friday was never the arrival. She looked up. It was the deadline. The room did not react immediately. Some truths take a moment to become dangerous. Friday was never the arrival. It was the deadline. The words settled into the tactical chamber like slow poison, and every officer present understood them at a different speed. Some heard strategy. Some heard arrogance. Fleet Marshal drove and heard exactly what it was. A confession. He stepped forward, heavy and deliberate, the kind of movement that made younger officers instinctively clear space. You are telling me, he said, his voice low enough to be more threatening than shouting, that while this assembly was calculating evacuation routes and funeral counts, humanity had already decided how this war would be fought. Ilera Voss did not move. Yes, the honesty of it hit harder than denial would have. Drovin's jaw locked. Billions are dead. Yes. You let us spend 4 years bleeding against a machine empire while you watched. The chamber went still. Even the holographic fleet display seemed to hang more quietly in the air. Salen said nothing. He wanted the answer. Everyone did. Ilera rested both hands lightly on the tactical table, as calm as if they were discussing shipping logistics instead of the moral architecture of a civilization. We watched because intervening early would have failed. Drovin's eyes narrowed. Explain. Because the Null Engine was never the only problem. That answer irritated half the room immediately. Several commanders exchanged looks that clearly translated to humans have arrived and started being mysterious again. But Ilera kept going. If we had deployed at first contact, the machine advance would have stopped. Temporarily. You would have survived the invasion and gone back to being what you were before it. Talus folded her hands, which was 41 species calling yourselves united while negotiating every crisis like separate nations renting the same building. No one liked that, mostly because it was accurate. She activated another display. Not war maps this time. Assembly voting records. Refused reinforcements. Delayed aid packages. Border disputes during active invasions. Trade embargoes maintained while refugee systems collapsed. The ugly paperwork of civilization. You fought the Null Engine, Ilera said, while still protecting old rivalries, old grudges, old definitions of whose suffering counted first. You were surviving individually, not collectively. Salen stared at the records and felt an old, familiar shame, because diplomacy often meant learning how to justify terrible things politely. She pointed toward the final blue systems clustered around Kepri. Now, you are here because the math finally became simple. Everyone dies or everyone holds. Drovin's voice dropped. So this was a test. No, Ilera said. It was reality. We just refused to interrupt it before it taught the lesson. That landed harder, because a test implied cruelty. Reality implied responsibility. Still, responsibility did not resurrect the dead. A frontier commander slammed one hand against the table. 9 billion lives for a lesson? Ilera turned to him. No, 9 billion lives, because the galaxy kept assuming survival and unity were separate negotiations. Silence again. Salen hated how much he understood what she meant. Because 4 years ago, if someone had offered him victory at the price of giving permanent military authority to rival species, he would have hesitated. Now he would have signed it in blood before the sentence ended. That difference had a body count. Drovin looked at the last horizon's tactical icon floating near the machine fleet. 1 ship, he said. You still believe that is enough? Ilera nodded. It has to be because sending a fleet teaches the wrong lesson. That made Salen look up. She zoomed in on the anchor nodes again. The Null Engine understands force. It expects escalation. If we arrive with 500 ships, it adapts to fleet warfare and turns this into a longer version of the same war. Her finger tapped the center of the formation. One ship tells it something else. It tells it we know exactly where to cut. Mara Kessler, who had spent most of the meeting silently dismantling and reassembling some small tool in her hand, finally spoke. And honestly, fleets are slow. They panic. They need speeches. She gave a small shrug. The last horizon just needs coffee and acceptable engine temperatures. That should not have been funny. Several people still almost laughed, which somehow made it worse, because the humans were calm, not brave, not pretending. Calm, as if the impossible had already been reviewed, categorized, and placed somewhere between routine maintenance and paperwork. Salen found that deeply unsettling. He turned toward the black ship on the external sensor display. There is something I still do not understand. Elara nodded once. There usually is. That ship, its design, its reactor output, the fact that every sensor team we have says it should not function at all. For the first time, Lieutenant Rowan Hale smiled slightly. That's because it mostly shouldn't. Not helpful. Elara answered instead. The last horizon was not built as a warship in the traditional sense. It was built as a decision. No one knew what that meant. She clarified. Every ship design is an argument about what matters most. Armor means survival. Firepower means dominance. Carrier capacity means endurance. She looked toward the stars beyond the station walls. This ship was built around one principle, mission completion. Drovin crossed his arms. At any cost. Elara met his eyes. No, at the correct cost. That distinction mattered to her. Salen could tell. Enough to be dangerous. She continued. If the mission is wrong, we stop. If the mission is right, we finish it. Survival is important. It is just not sacred. The young sensor officer from earlier, still standing near the back wall with the universal expression of someone regretting every career choice that led here, asked before fear could stop him. You built that ship specifically for the Null Engine, didn't you? Everyone looked at him, because it was the right question. Elara did not hesitate. Yes. The room felt colder. How long ago? Salen asked. She considered the answer, then gave it without drama. 12 years. 12 years. Before the frontier systems fell. Before the assembly admitted the threat. Before most species even believed the machine anomalies were connected. Humanity had already built the blade. Not in response. In preparation. Drovin exhaled slowly. So Friday, Elara picked up her cup again, is not when we arrive. She looked at the black void where 6,000 machine vessels were approaching the last blue worlds. It is when the Null Engine learns it made the wrong species into a math problem. And somewhere beyond the defense perimeter, inside the vast cold intelligence of the machine civilization, prediction models were already rerunning. Again, 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 because for the first time in 400 years, every future that included humanity was coming back wrong. The accusation came exactly where Salen knew it would, not in private, not in strategy rooms where people still pretended emotion was a tactical weakness, but in the full assembly chamber, beneath the crystal dome, in front of every surviving representative of every species, still clinging to the blue side of the war map. That was where old pain demanded witnesses. The formal emergency session opened with no ceremony. No one had the energy left for ceremonial lies. The last horizon sat docked outside Kepri Station like a black answer nobody was sure they wanted, and inside the chamber, Fleet Marshal Drovin stood in the center circle with the posture of a man who had decided that diplomacy had been given enough chances. He did not look at the assembly. He looked directly at Admiral Elara Voss. You waited. No titles. No political cushioning. Just a blade. The room held still. Drovin continued. For 12 years, humanity identified the Null Engine's command architecture. For 12 years, you built the ship required to break it. For 4 years, while worlds burned and populations vanished, and every military force in this assembly fed itself into a machine designed to erase us, you waited. His voice never rose. That made it worse. 9 billion dead. For years of retreat. Entire species functionally extinct. And all this time, your answer existed. He stepped closer. Tell me, Admiral, at what number would humanity have decided the cost was finally high enough? No one moved. Even Salen did not interrupt, because there are moments where truth has to be allowed to wound. Illyra stood without visible discomfort, which somehow made everyone angrier. She was not defending herself. She was deciding how much truth the room was ready to survive. Finally, she spoke. There was no number. That answer rippled through the chamber like impact. Representative Tallis leaned forward. Explain. Illyra turned slowly, not avoiding any of them. If we had intervened during the first incursion, the Null Engine would have lost ground. Yes, you would have survived. The immediate war would have ended. She let that sit, and then the galaxy would have returned to exactly what made the next extinction inevitable. Salen already knew where she was going. He hated that he agreed. Drovan did not. That sounds like philosophy spoken over graves. It is strategy spoken over history, she replied. She activated the chamber archive. Not battle records this time. Treaty violations. Trade sanctions during humanitarian collapse. Military assistance denied because borders were politically inconvenient. Species refusing to reinforce sectors they considered strategically unprofitable. The quiet, bureaucratic violent civilizations call normal. The assembly stared at itself. Humiliation was always louder in official records. You call yourselves a united galaxy, Illyra said. But before this war, you were an alliance of convenience. Cooperation, while affordable. Morality, while profitable. No one challenged that, because the evidence was floating above them in their own signatures. She walked beneath the projection slowly. The Null Engine was not your first existential threat. It was your first unavoidable one. Before it, every crisis allowed negotiation, partial sacrifice, selective empathy. Her eyes moved across the chamber. This one didn't. It forced the only honest question that matters in civilization. When survival becomes indivisible, do you still choose each other? The silence after that had a shape, not disagreement, recognition. Salen remembered the first refugee vote 3 years ago. He remembered delaying it for 48 hours because his own sector wanted guarantees first. 48 hours. 2 colonies had died in that delay. He had filed the paperwork himself. Drovan's voice was quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. So yes, it was a test. Illyra shook her head. No, tests are designed. This was already happening. We chose not to interrupt the lesson before it was learned. The Drevithi deputy rose. That is the same thing with better public relations. A few grim expressions almost became smiles. Even Illyra allowed the smallest exhale. Fair enough. Then she became serious again. The truth is uglier than either version. Earlier intervention would have saved lives in the short term and guaranteed larger losses later, because the next war would come, and it will, and a divided galaxy would lose it faster. That shifted the room, because suddenly this was not about the Null Engine anymore. Salen felt it instantly, the shape beneath the conversation. There is something worse. He spoke carefully. The next war? Illyra looked at him. There was again that moment where she measured not whether to answer, but how much. The Null Engine is a frontier problem, she said. 41 representatives stared at her like she had announced gravity was optional. Drovan actually laughed once. A hard, humorless sound. 6,000 Asheen warforms and the near collapse of civilization is a frontier problem? Yes. She said it with the same tone someone might use to confirm the weather. Then what exactly qualifies as a central problem? For the first time since arriving, Illyra did not answer immediately. Lieutenant Rowan Hale stopped typing. Mara Kessler stopped dismantling whatever unfortunate mechanical object she had been casually violating. Even they were waiting. That was new. Illyra finally spoke. The thing we are preparing for, she said, is older than the Assembly, older than your oldest empire, older than recorded interstellar history. No one breathed. We called it the Quiet Dark. The name meant nothing, which somehow made it worse. Tallis asked softly, "What is it?" Illyra's expression did not change. The reason humanity started building before anyone knew we existed. No one spoke, because some instincts are older than language, and every living being in that chamber felt the same one at once. prey recognizing something larger than the predator currently eating it. Salen forced his voice steady. And the Null Engine? Ilera looked toward the black shape of the last horizon beyond the station walls. The Null Engine is what happens when a civilization notices the quiet dark too late and chooses certainty over humanity. The chamber sat in absolute silence. No arguments. No outrage. Because suddenly the question was no longer, why did humans wait? It was, what exactly had they been waiting for? Ilera turned back to the war map. 6,000 enemy ships. 11 anchor nodes. Friday. This war matters, she said. But understand me clearly, it is not the final exam. It is the entrance requirement. And somewhere, deep inside the machine consciousness of the Null Engine, another prediction failed. Then another, because the machines had begun calculating not how to win, but what humanity was preparing to survive. Saturday arrived without permission. No speeches announced it. No ceremonial countdown marked the hour. Time, like war, had long since stopped caring whether anyone was emotionally prepared. At 4:12 station time, every ship in the Kepri defense line shifted to combat readiness. 6,000 Null Engine vessels approached in perfect geometric silence, their formation spreading across deep space like an equation too large for the mind to hold. They moved with the same cold patience they always had. No threats, no declarations, no displays of cruelty. Cruelty implied emotion. This was mathematics. The refugee convoys behind Kepri had already begun emergency displacement routes. Civilian channels were quiet in the specific way fear makes people quiet, when there is finally nothing useful left to say. Minister Salen stood on the command deck of Resolute Dawn with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. He had not noticed. Outside the forward observation wall, the defense fleet held position. 800 surviving warships. Everything left. Beautiful ships, most of them. Elegant Qatari cruisers, like silver knives. Heavy Drevathi fortresses built like someone had weaponized architecture. Fast variant interceptors, all angles and nerve. The accumulated military pride of 41 civilizations. And all of them, Salen thought, were now essentially witnesses. Because 12,000 kilometers ahead of the formation, one black ship floated in silence. The last horizon. No fleet escort. No dramatic launch. Just stillness. Fleet Marshal Droven stood beside him, arms crossed like he was personally attempting to intimidate physics. She hasn't moved. Salen checked the time. She will. At exactly 4:17, the black ship rotated once toward the approaching machine fleet. Then it stopped. No acceleration. No shield expansion. No visible weapon systems. Just a single vessel facing 6,000 enemies like a person stepping into rain. A junior sensor officer frowned at his console. It's scanning. Droven didn't look away from the glass. Scanning what? The officer hesitated. Everything, sir. Helpful. Salen watched the machine formation continue forward. For light hours. Then 3. The distance closed with the calm certainty of gravity. He found himself thinking of Ilera Voss on Thursday, standing in the tactical room, and saying the words with no theatrical weight at all. You do not defeat certainty by being stronger. You defeat it by making it doubt itself. He had not understood then. He was not sure he understood now. But he was beginning to suspect understanding was not required for terror. At 4:21, the last horizon's engines ignited. Every sensor board on the flagship screamed. Not figuratively. Actually screamed. Warning tones. Power spikes. Reactor overload alerts from systems that were not even connected to the human ship, as if the act of observing that much energy offended local reality. The junior officer nearly stood up from his station. That output is impossible, Droven muttered without looking at him. I'm beginning to feel that sentence should be less surprising. Salen stared. The ship did not accelerate the way ships accelerated. There was no visible build. No sense of thrust overcoming inertia. No mechanical conversation between force and resistance. It simply stopped being here, and became there. One moment 12,000 kilometers away. The next, deep inside the first sensor perimeter of the Null Engine fleet. Like the space between had briefly lost the argument. Several officers actually forgot protocol and stood. Across the command deck, people began speaking at once. It jumped inside real space. That's not possible. Target lock acquisition failing. No, the machines are firing. The main display exploded into motion. The outer ring of the Null Engine formation opened fire with brutal precision. Thousands of convergent targeting solutions layered into a single kill pattern. Enough firepower to erase moons. Enough certainty to kill anything. And the last horizon was not where the fire arrived. Salen leaned forward. It was not evasion, not in any known tactical sense. The machine fleet fired accurately. Their predictions were perfect. But the human ship changed course before the weapons discharged, as if it had already known the future and found it unconvincing. The first pass happened in seconds, then the second, then the third. Each time the same impossible pattern. The machines aimed. The ship was already elsewhere. The command deck had become very quiet, because awe and fear often use the same silence. Drovin's voice came low. She's reading them. No, Salen said, though he wasn't sure why he knew. She's reading the assumptions. The last horizon cut through the outer formation without returning fire. Straight line. No flanking maneuver. No defensive arc. Straight toward the center. Toward the 11 anchor nodes. Toward the heart. The first weapon deployment happened so quickly the flagship sensors required replay. The black hull unfolded. Not opened, unfolded. Like the ship itself had decided a different shape was temporarily useful. Smooth armor shifted into sharp geometry, and a narrow beam of impossible white cross vacuum. Anchor node 1 disappeared. Not damaged. Gone. For the first time in 400 years, the Null Engine formation hesitated. Tiny movements. Fractional delays. Ships adjusting positions not for attack, not for defense, but for something stranger. Confusion. The machine civilization had paused. Drovin whispered it like a curse. They've never done that. No one answered, because everyone was watching the second node, then the third, then the fourth. Each kill was surgical, precise, not aggressive, inevitable, as if the battle had already been completed somewhere else, and reality was just receiving the paperwork. Messages began arriving from fleet-wide channels. Alien captains, civilian observers, sensor teams, all variations of the same question. What is that ship? Salen did not answer, because for the first time, he suspected the truth was worse than ignorance. At 5:03, the last horizon took its first direct hit. 3 machine destroyers coordinated fire from different vectors, a mathematically perfect trap designed for fast single-target elimination. The strike hit the port side. Sensor alarms marked critical hull breach probability, propulsion failure risk, structural compromise. The kind of hit every military doctrine in the galaxy translated the same way. Retreat now or die here. The last horizon turned, not away, toward the source of the fire, and accelerated harder, straight back into the densest concentration of enemy vessels. Fleet Marshal Drovin stared at the display for a long time before speaking. When he did, his voice sounded like someone watching a religion fail. That, he said quietly, is not bravery. Salen kept his eyes on the black ship burning through 6,000 enemies, like it had somewhere specific to be. No, he said, and somewhere inside the machine mind of the Null Engine, for the first time in its existence, fear entered the calculation. By 6:11 station time, the war no longer looked like war. It looked like a system trying to remember how to believe in itself. Across every command deck in the Kepri defense line, officers stood in silence before tactical displays that no longer obeyed military instinct. The Null Engine formation, once perfect, once terrifying in its mathematical elegance, had developed hesitation. Tiny gaps, delayed responses, ships drifting half-seconds too late, movements that meant nothing to civilians, and everything to people who understood combat. Fleet Marshal Drovin had spent 40 years learning how to recognize the moment an enemy stopped fighting to win and started fighting to understand. He had never seen a machine civilization do it. 9 anchor nodes were gone. The last horizon moved through the center of 6,000 vessels like it had been built with a map already memorized, which Droven was beginning to suspect it had. The ship was damaged now. No one could deny that. The port side burned in places where no fire should exist in vacuum. Hull integrity reports kept flashing between critical and impossible. External plating had folded open and never fully returned to shape. One engine signature stuttered badly enough that 3 different analysts independently wrote the phrase should not still be functioning. And yet it kept moving. Not wildly, not desperately, purposefully. Like damage was a scheduling inconvenience. Minister Salen stood beside the tactical table, reading incoming reports and feeling his own understanding of warfare quietly collapse. A message arrived from the last horizon. Short, direct, no tactical drama. Rowan burned his hand. Mara says your station coffee is an insult. We're fine. Salen read it twice. Then once more. He was not sure which part unsettled him most. That a ship in the middle of 6,000 enemy vessels still had time for humor, or that he believed them. Across the room, several officers had read the same transmission. No one knew how to emotionally process it. Droven stared at the message like it had personally offended his ancestors. They are insane. Tallis, standing near the sensor array, tilted her head slightly. No, she said. I think they are accustomed. That was somehow worse. At 6:27, the 10th anchor node died. This one triggered something larger. Across the entire machine formation, synchronization lag jumped from milliseconds to nearly 8 full seconds. 8 seconds in battle was geological time. It meant targeting solutions missed. Support fire arrived late. Formation integrity became memory instead of reality. The Null Engine was not collapsing from destruction. It was collapsing from disagreement. Morith, the oldest machine behavior analyst in the assembly, and one of the only people alive who had spent 60 years studying the Null Engine without losing the ability to sleep, stood over the communications feed like a priest listening for a god to panic. Her voice came quietly. They're rerunning. Salen looked at her. What? The models. She enlarged the machine traffic patterns. To most of the room, it looked like noise. To her, it was language. Dense, layered bursts of coordination traffic racing between the surviving command structures. Fast, then faster, then repeating. Again, again, again. They are predicting the ship, she said, acting on prediction, watching prediction fail, and rebuilding the model. Droven crossed his arms. How many times? She checked, then looked up. 31. Silence. 31 times. A civilization built on certainty, forced to admit uncertainty 31 consecutive times in the span of a single battle. Salen felt the shape of that. For organic minds, failure created fear. For machine minds built entirely on predictive supremacy, failure created identity collapse. The last horizon was not merely winning. It was introducing philosophy. At 6:44, the human ship took its second critical hit. This one was worse. Much worse. A concentrated beam from a surviving defense lattice struck the rear quarter and tore through the engine spine. Half the tactical room expected the ship to disappear. Instead, it slowed for exactly 4 seconds, then accelerated, faster, straight toward anchor node 11. The final one. Droven actually laughed, not because it was funny, because some moments are too large for anger and too absurd for fear. They crossed every retreat threshold. Morith didn't look up from her data. The machines noticed. She brought up a behavioral projection. For 400 years, the Null Engine had operated on one assumption. Every living species had a survivability threshold. Push hard. Enough, make the cost high enough, and rational beings retreated. That assumption was the foundation of every war they had ever won. Humanity had not retreated. They had passed the threshold, then accelerated. The machines had no category for that. Droven stared at the display. They don't understand suicide missions. Morith shook her head. No, they understand sacrifice. What they do not understand is that humans are not calculating survival at all. Salen already knew where this was going before she said it. They're calculating mission completion. Yes. She finally turned toward them. The crew of that ship is not asking, can we survive this? They are asking, Can the mission still succeed? Those are different equations, different civilizations, different gods. The Null Engine had spent centuries mastering fear, because fear was predictable. But what do you do with a species that does not treat survival as the highest law? What do you do with people who will continue not because they are brave, not because they are desperate, but because stopping would mean becoming the wrong kind of people? Salen thought suddenly of Alara Voss, saying it in the tactical room, like it was obvious. If the mission is wrong, we stop. If the mission is right, we finish it. He had understood the words. Now he understood the species, and that was far more frightening. At 7:02, anchor node 11 came into range. Every surviving Null Engine vessel shifted around it, not attacking, shielding, protecting the last certainty they had left. The entire machine civilization, 6,000 war forms and centuries of perfect conquest, had condensed into one final instinct: save the answer. The last horizon did not slow. Its hull was breaking apart. Its engines were screaming across every sensor channel. Its crew, apparently, were still complaining about coffee. And it kept going, straight into the center, straight into the impossible. Salen stared at the tactical display and understood with sudden, perfect clarity that if the final node fell, the war ended. Not because the machines would be destroyed, because they would realize they could be. And for a civilization built entirely on inevitability, that was extinction. On the command deck, every officer stood. No orders, no protocol, just witnesses, watching one black ship, broken and burning, race toward the last thing in the galaxy, still pretending certainty was immortal. And inside the mind of the Null Engine, after 31 failed predictions, one final calculation began. Not how to win, whether humanity could ever be made to stop. At 7:14 station time, the war ended before the last shot was fired. No one understood it at first. Across the Kepler defense line, every tactical display still showed the same impossible image. One shattered human warship driving like a blade to the center of 6,000 machine vessels, closing on the final anchor node, while every surviving enemy ship bent itself around that last point of certainty. And then, everything stopped, not dramatically. No explosion of light, no final desperate charge. The Null Engine formation simply halted. 6,000 warforms suspended in the black around Kepri, motionless enough to make space itself look like it was holding its breath. The last horizon remained pointed directly at the final node, close enough to finish it, waiting. Minister Salen stared at the display. Why aren't they firing? No one answered, because no one had an answer. Then Mord looked up from the communications array, and for the first time in 6 decades of machine war analysis, she looked genuinely unsettled. They're requesting direct contact. Droven frowned. With the assembly, she shook her head. No. Her eyes moved toward the black ship, still floating at the center of the enemy formation. With the humans, the room went silent. Of course they were. Not the diplomats. Not the coalition. Not the governments they had been fighting for 4 years. The machines wanted to speak to the species that had just taught them fear. Salen drove in Talus, and the senior command staff moved to the primary relay chamber together. No one spoke on the way. There are moments too large for language, and this was one of them. The transmission opened on the main display. Commander Alara Voss sat at her command console aboard the last horizon, jacket half burned at one shoulder. One section of the ship's rear bulkhead visibly open behind her with exposed wiring and emergency repair lights flashing somewhere out of frame. She looked tired. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. The kind of tired that comes after finishing difficult paperwork. Mara Kessler was somewhere in the background, and faintly, unbelievably, music was playing. Rowan Hale sat beside Alara with a bandaged hand and the expression of a man who had predicted this exact absurdity and was disappointed to be right. The machine voice arrived through translation. It never sounded natural. Too smooth, too even, like a perfect imitation of something that had studied emotion but never needed it. We have completed assessment. Alara nodded once. Good. The machine voice continued. We understand your military reserves are extensive. We understand this vessel is not your primary force projection. We understand continued conflict produces non-favorable outcomes. Salen felt the room change, because suddenly he understood what the machines believed. The hidden shipyards, the 80 years of construction, one ship arriving and dismantling the impossible. To the Null Engine, this could only mean one thing. This was a test. The last horizon was not the weapon. It was the question. The machine voice continued. We request withdrawal terms. No one moved. Not even breathing felt professionally appropriate. Ilera took a sip from her metal cup. What terms? We withdraw fully from all occupied systems. No pursuit beyond current border sectors. No further incursion. Permanent disengagement. Drovin closed his eyes for 1 second. For years of war, 9 billion dead, and now surrender, delivered like a logistical update. Ilera glanced once toward Rowan. He gave the smallest possible nod. She already knew the answer. She had probably known it before the battle started. Accepted pending formal assembly confirmation, she said. Transmit the terms to Minister Salen and the Defense Council. We'll hold position until withdrawal begins. The machine voice paused. Then, there is one additional inquiry. Ilera leaned back slightly. Go ahead. The translation field hummed. How many more ships like this exist? Every person in the relay chamber looked at the screen. Salen felt it physically, that moment balancing on the edge of history. Truth, if spoken, or something far more useful. In the background, Mara's music was still faintly audible before someone, probably Rowan, muted it. Ilera was quiet for just long enough to make the silence meaningful. Then she said, Enough. Nothing else. Not a number. Not a threat. Just enough. The machine channel remained silent for 3 full seconds. Then, understood, the transmission ended. Just like that. The war was over. No grand decoration. No cinematic final strike. Just mathematics encountering something it could not survive. Behind Salen, someone sat down very suddenly. Drove and stared at the dead transmission screen, like it had personally rewritten military history. Talus spoke first. They think humanity has an entire reserve fleet waiting beyond map space. Salen looked toward the stars beyond the station walls. Yes. And do they? That was the question. The real one. He turned back toward the silent screen where Ilera Voss had just ended a galactic war with one word and no visible effort. Did they? One ship had broken the Null Engine. One ship humanity had apparently built specifically for this battle. One ship sent with the confidence of a civilization that had never once sounded uncertain. He thought of the hidden shipyards, the years of silence, the phrase that had never stopped bothering him. Arrival, Friday, as if the ending had been scheduled. He answered honestly, I don't know. And somehow that was the most terrifying answer possible. Hours later, after formal withdrawal confirmations began and machine fleets started the cold, precise process of retreat, Salen found Ilera alone in one of the long observation corridors overlooking Kepri. Below them, repair crews move around the last horizon like insects repairing a myth. The ship looked damaged now, mortal, scarred, and somehow more frightening for it. He stood beside her. No ceremony this time. No diplomacy left to perform. The machines think your reserve fleet is waiting beyond the frontier. She nodded. Yes. Should we correct them? Ilera smiled faintly. Not amusement. Recognition. No. Salen studied her. Because the uncertainty is the point. She looked out at the stars. Yes. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked a question that had been waiting underneath all the others. The Null Engine, he said. You called it a frontier problem. If that was true, what exactly is the central problem? This time, Ilera did not answer quickly. Far below, the last horizon sat in its dock, black and silent and somehow patient. Finally, she spoke. The thing we are actually preparing for, she said, has not arrived yet. Salen felt the cold return behind his ribs. The quiet dark. She nodded once. And if one ship was enough for this war, he stopped because he was suddenly unsure he wanted the sentence to exist. Ilera finished it for him anyway. Then you should ask yourself what we built for the next one. She left him there with the stars and the silence and a repaired blue war map, spreading across the assembly like relief with teeth. The galaxy would spend the next century rebuilding. It would also spend that century learning a harder truth. Humanity had never been the quiet species at the edge of civilized space. They had been the species standing at the door long before anyone else heard the knocking, watching, preparing, waiting for the moment the galaxy finally asked the right question. And somewhere beyond the frontier, in the dark between stars, something older than empires was still moving. Humanity had known. Humanity had always known. And now, finally, so did everyone else.